you for being here today and everything else. And again, how many of this is your first big soil health event? Wonderful, wonderful. You will come away inspired. You will come away with questions, and you'll come away with some knowledge. And as we go through this today, we're going to cover a lot of what I call soil health what-ifs. And there are a lot of things that, and I'll explain what the what-ifs mean as we go along in all of this, but I got to start with a review because people that aren't veterans at this meeting and everything else, and that's the foundations of soil health. Really, what do we mean by all of this and everything else? If you go to NRCS and you pull up soil health, you get this diagram that says minimize your tillage, maximize biodiversity, maximize your living roots, maximize soil cover, and we'll come back to that as well. All of that is set up to do this, which is the functions of soil relative to agriculture. We want that soil to hold our plants up. We want it to be a water reservoir. We want it to be a nutrient source or a nutrient supply for our plants. We want to have it be a carbon cycling piece of this whole puzzle. We have to have efficient gas exchange, not only CO2, but also oxygen in this. And we actually would like it to decompose pesticides and antibiotics in that soil. FAO, the Food and Ag Organization, lists 14 different functions of soil. But we really boiled it down just to a few because those are critical how you have to think about this process. And if you look at regenerative agriculture and all of the things that we've talked about from a regenerative ag perspective is that it's a little bit like those soil health principles from NRCS with one addition. Regenerative agriculture talks about bringing livestock into the system. Bringing livestock into the system as a carbon source for all this. And you'll understand that as we go along of why that becomes important in all this overall piece. So as we begin this overall process, and you think about regenerative agriculture, it's really about energy transfer, capture of that energy, putting it into that soil that sustains a biological activity. Those are really the foundations of what we have to talk about for agriculture. They really are critical to our future food supply. They're critical to our future of environmental health as we look at all of those different pieces around that. So that's the brief introduction to why this becomes important. It's the brief introduction that kind of sets the stage for those people who haven't heard about soil health and all these different things. And throughout this talk, it's really built on audience participation. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I expect you to answer. Okay, so we're going to start off. Here's the pre-talk quiz. Now, I taught at a university level for 8 years and everything else. You always kind of want to start the class off by saying, you know, kind of where's the class at? What do they know? What don't they know? And then you come back and ask them embarrassing questions at the end on the final so that you see if they really captured anything out of this. So that's where we're going to start. So the first question out there is that how many of you have questions, young or new in terms of this overall process, and how to integrate the principles of soil health and regenerative agriculture? Show of hands. How many people have questions about how to do this? Yeah, pretty much. Taylor's taking notes. She'll be answering this later. The other question is, how many of you have questions about the response you're seeing in the soil or the crop? Yeah, even more hands. Things aren't quite always clear relative to soil health. So how do we begin to understand these dynamics that are going on? The other piece of this, how many wonder how to start this overall regenerative process? Where do I get on the Ferris wheel? Where do I get on this system? Very few hands went up, so everybody knows where to start? Just start anywhere. Just start, okay? And the other question out there is how many of you wonder if these principles apply to every soil and every field? Everybody got all that figured out? So if I ask you about a canistale soil in Iowa, or Lucas, what's your favorite soil in Missouri?
Mexico, Jerry.
Yeah, the Mexico. Would you see the same response in those two soils? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on what parameter we look at. These are questions that we should be looking at. These are questions that really aren't meant to stump you, but to make you say, as we go through the rest of this talk, how do these pieces fit together? How do we begin to understand the dynamics of all these different systems that are out there? Because at the end of the day, this is what you want from a cropping system. You want profit, you want productivity, and I put a third P on there for pleasure. How many people get excitement out of looking at an extremely dark green corn crop out there? Yeah, we all like to see a pleasure in a peanut. We don't talk about quantifying that in lots of ways, but in reality, we derive pleasure for seeing an actively growing crop that looks healthy, looks pleasurable, all these other things that are out there. And we undervalue that. The first piece on this is that profitability, because the whole piece of this is how do we make a profit? I have never, ever met a producer that said they had too much money in the bank. They may not understand how much profit they're making, but they would always like more money out of that system. And the productivity piece becomes in a lot of different ways. The productivity piece may not necessarily be yield, but the efficiency of what we produce. And we need to understand that all of these pieces come together in lots of different ways. So you probably have got a question to saying, where's he headed with all of this? Where are you really headed in all this? And so I'm going to give you the origins of the what ifs. When Liz asked me to give this talk and everything, I thought, you know, what's new and different that we can talk about for soil health that we haven't talked about before? And that is, so I came up and said, you know, I get a lot of questions from producers. I get a lot of questions about how do we do these things? And that was the purpose of those 4 questions that were at the beginning. Last January, I did 11 talks, actually 14 talks, in 3 weeks, all the way from Rapid City to Monroe City, Missouri, to someplace in Illinois, I forget where I was, out to Colorado. The purpose of that was that delayed my visit to my town home in Arizona. I do escape the winters. That's the advantage of having white hair and no longer working, but all of those soil health talks and everything, I spent a lot of time listening as to what the conversations were about producers that they were asking as well. And a lot of this also comes from observations of changes in the soil. Sometimes we need to observe rather than just say we know how to measure it. Sometimes our best observations and the best measurement we can make is what we see with our eyes, both in the soil as well as in the crop, all those other pieces. So these what ifs are really a combination of these things. What you've asked, what I've gleaned from listening in on conversations, observing all these different systems that are out here. So if we think about this, the soil becomes the foundation of our efficient crop production. You got all these other things that we need to figure out. How do we capture water more efficiently? How do we begin to all this? Because water is the #1 limiting factor in crop production. We've got to have root exploration. How many people have a penetrometer? How many people use that penetrometer? See, I narrowed the audience down real quickly. Roots have to explore that soil and everything else. A lot of pieces in terms of nutrient availability. How are those nutrients being taken up? How much is in that plant? All those other pieces that are going on. And then finally, in terms of that gas exchange. We spend a lot of time measuring carbon dynamics between the soil and the atmosphere and CO2 as well. But the next gas we ought to be measuring is oxygen. Because everything that's living below that soil surface requires oxygen because it's an aerobic system. And unless we have an efficient oxygen supply, it's just like having a limited breathing as a human. And so these become very serious questions that we ought to be asking ourselves, is how's that oxygen getting in there and what's it doing to the biological system in terms of all of this. Other pieces of this that we got to look at is this, what I call the path towards evaluating soil health impacts. And in looking at this, and as we begin to do a lot of different analysis of types of studies that are out there, looking at how we begin to evaluate the soil health impacts and everything else. And this is kind of crop-centric. I'll have another one later that talks about soil-centric, is that in the soil or the crop-centric piece of this, it's a concept that I developed a number of years ago that are called genetics by environment by management. How's genetics by environment by management all fit together? I'll explain that as we go along. I'll talk about yield gaps in terms of how efficient are we in terms of capturing that genetic potential out there. What's the spatial variation within fields? And what's the temporal variation in production among years? Those 4 things give you a glimpse of agricultural production in ways that sometimes we don't think about. And so when we really begin to look at this puzzle that we call the soil plant atmosphere continuum, it really is saying, how do we know where we're at now? And as we change, what's changing along the way as we begin to put these pieces together. So we look at this, and I'll just look at temporal variation, and I won't go through in a lot of detail on this. The temporal variation is basically this resilient to weather variation among years. When we talk about the temporal variation, I'm saying how much is that yield going up year to year and all these other pieces that are going on. And all of this, and you begin to understand the dynamics of this system. The spatial variation is just what sort of uniformity within soil types within the fields. And you begin to look at this and saying, as we look at this spatial variation, we begin to understand the dynamics of all of this. And yield gaps are nothing more than our ability to capture that genetic potential. And all these pieces that are going on. And G by E by M now gets us into the point of saying, how effective are those management practices? How effective are those management practices in either changing the soil or changing the crop, getting back to that profitability, getting back to that production level of all of those pieces that are out there? And so it gives you a framework of saying, how's all this coming together? Because as we go forward, we're going to have to increase our food production. We're going to have to increase the quality of that food production. We're going to have to do that on even less and less land every year because we take it out for roads, we take it out for houses, all those other pieces that are going on. A lot of you have seen this. This is some data that is analyzed out of Wayne Frederick's data that we took and began to look at soils within fields, and we looked at the yield monitor data across an 18-year history of how these changed in terms of strip till and no-till crops out there. And it's, for those of you who are in statistics or have taken statistics, you remember that when we talk about distributions of everything, we talk about mean, median, skewness, and kurtosis. And you always wondered what in the world people were going to do with skewness and kurtosis. You know? This is the real-life application of those two moments in statistics that everybody wondered what in the world had any application to real-world problems. And so here you get to see the piece of this. You go back on that first one, is Ostrander loam. This is the 2004, second year after that field was converted to no-till corn. And then 2018, after that intervening period of 15 growing seasons out there, is now you begin to see that all of that yield distribution that was on the left-hand side of that curve has disappeared, and that distribution has become tighter. Skewness is that evenness of the distribution. Kurtosis is how tight that distribution is about the mean. You see how tight we made that? You see that same thing in a Franklin loam. There's about 20 different soils that were in all these different fields, because this is not just one field. This was 10 fields across 18 years. And we see that same thing going on. As we begin to change that soil, we made those soils more uniform in terms of crop production. And if you think about that, any time that we take out that left side of that distribution is profit, because we're getting a better return for everything that we put into that system. And so you see all of these different pieces coming together and saying, this is the value of changing that soil out there. Organic matters went up, infiltration went up, water storage went up, all these other things changed within that we talk about, these attributes of soil health, and they really begin to change the system. But the bigger part, from my perspective, is really revealed as we begin to go through even more of a deeper analysis. And that is that we begin to look at what was occurring in Wayne's fields against Osage County, which is or Mitchell County, where his farms were all located, is that as we began to change that system, we became more efficient in the use of water. So we got more yield per every raindrop that fell during the growing season out there. Also, when you start looking at his change over time, is that temporal variation, because we had that water available, we were no longer dependent on every little bit of rainfall that fell. Iowa, for the most part, is water limited in July and August in a lot of different cases. So we see a lot of temporal variation that's going on. We saw an increased water use efficiency. The thing that amazed us is that we broke that correlation because we improved the soil. That correlation between excessive rainfall in April and May is always the lower county yields across the Midwest, because we either delay planting, we drown out spots in the field, we cause all sorts of problems, we limit oxygen coming in. It's a water dynamic problem that we see out there. And we broke that correlation over time because we could plant on time, we had all that aeration going into the soil, we see all these different pieces, and at the same time, there's a the positive correlation between the more it rains in July and August in typical years, the higher the average county yield, because we're water limited at that time of the growing season. So we see all these different pieces. That's a simple little change of saying, changing the tillage practice, adding the cover crop, improving soil health, paid dividends. Field uniformity, temporal variation, all these other things that occurred in this overall process. I've spent the last 15 years of my career looking at yield gaps. Yield gaps are basically a metric that says how efficient are we in terms of management? How efficient are we in terms of making progress towards increasing our productivity? But they also give us a metric of saying, where are our failures? and it gives us a metric that allows us to what factors may be limiting yield. And so, just to give you some insights into this, corn production across the Midwest, there's 3 major factors that is influencing that productivity. One is high nighttime temperatures during August. The hotter it is during August, the lower the average yields because we spend a lot of energy in respiration and making that plant less efficient in terms of storing grain or making grain. The other 2 pieces are related to rainfall. The more it rains in the spring, the higher the yield gap, and the less it rains in July and August, the larger the yield gap. So you see all of those are basically gives us different dynamics, and so I spent a lot of time looking at this because they do give us that difference between what we're actually getting and the potential yield out there. Every field and every farm has an attainable yield. That's the yield in which we have minimum impacts. That's at best year, and I found that producers remember 3 years. You remember your best year, your worst year, and last year. And no matter what audience I'm in, all across the Midwest, if I ask them about what was the failure in that, they always say, well, you know, it was this year we had a lot of rainfall. That was my lowest yield for these reasons. This was my best year because of this. And then I can tell you what last year was. Those are the 3 endpoints that everybody kind of looks at. And they really are related to how water and soil are related in all of this. But you can begin to look at all this. We've looked at dynamics across the overall system and everything. Just to put it into a different way, everybody's always fascinated now, we're a little bit above 600 in terms of corn yield, a little above 200 in terms of soy. That's kind of the genetic potential we all talk about in all of this. The attainable yield could be close to 250. The actual yield may be in that 180 range. That difference between 250 and 180 is 70 bushels yield gap in all of this, because in the best conditions we could get 250, but if we're getting 180, you've invested into a 250 crop, got 180, that's reducing profitability and all these other things. That becomes part of that resilience piece of this puzzle as we begin to look at it. And so you begin to do this. We've done it for wheat across the Midwest as well in terms of these different dynamics, because it is a way of saying what's causing this to occur. What's causing this different dynamic that's out there. But now it really gets critical, because how many of you critically examine each field for its performance? I know Ted does, because he and I have been talking about it.
I've only got 2 fields.
Yeah. One on this hand, one on that hand. No. Here's my challenge to you, is if you want to move forward, you have to understand what your baseline is. But if you want to move forward, you also understand how you're moving away from that baseline. And it really gets down to the point of taking and examining each field for its performance. One of the most enlightening conversations that I've had is with a group of producers in Illinois, because I was doing a tour of Illinois. 5 days, 5 talks, 5 cities. And I asked one group at the top end of the state, I said, you know, are all of your fields making you money? Blank stares. You'd have thought I'm asked to determine how much income tax they paid this last year. And so I had to probe a little different and say, you know, are all of your fields making your money? And they said, we don't know. I said, are your farms making you money? Well, the farms are making you money. But are each of your fields making, as a subset of that farm, making you money? And And it finally got around to the point of saying, you know, why aren't we examining individual fields for their performance and their efficiency? I think that's going to be a critical step as we move forward in soil health, is how do you look spatially? How do you look temporally in the things that are occurring out there? You have to understand that I grew up in one of the original applications of remote sensing in the world. We built programs that helped us predict yield throughout the world. How do we begin to assess foreign countries? I have extreme fascination with being able to look at a field and say, what's its spatial pattern? How does that spatial pattern change over time? What's stable within that? All those other pieces of that puzzle. And if we really begin to look at this seriously, it's not a matter of looking at that yield map and saying, oh, this part of the field was 325 bushels of corn, and the other part was 180. My question is, was that 320 bushel yield that you observed, was that the same part of that field year after year? Now we start stacking yield maps up. We start stacking the soil maps up. We start looking at this in a much different basis than what we've been doing before, because unless we understand how that field may be behaving over time, we really can't begin to understand the impacts of the management systems that we put into it. We're going to have to ask different questions about all of this, and so critical performance of a field has really become paramount as we begin to think about this system that's out there. What's the most limiting factor in crop production? Audience participation time. This isn't for my benefit. Water. I gave that away several slides ago. Water is the most limiting factor in all of this, and if you look at this, this is again where we've done yield gap analysis. This is just a frequency distribution of yield loss over time, looking at 4 different Iowa counties. We could extend it to the whole state. You look at all of this, at 20% of that yield loss is about 80% of the time, and it surprised us because those lower parts are always due to those really drouthy years and all of this. But that 20% yield loss was much more due to short-term events. Short-term events, by Hatfield's definition, is where we needed maybe an inch of rainfall each week to meet atmospheric demand, but we only got a ½ inch. So we get these short-term stresses that may not be enough to make that soybean leaf droop, make that corn begin to curl, but it had a physiological impact. It had a physiological impact that just kind of takes away yield. And it takes away because that plant isn't as efficient as it can be. And so all these other pieces that are out there are really in these different dynamics. And so as we begin to understand that, and when we begin to think back to that graph that I showed you on Wayne's fields, where we began to change that distribution, is that we were influencing these water dynamics. We were influencing the water infiltration. We were influencing water storage. We made that water more available to that. And so when you begin to do that, you begin to increase the uniformity within that soil and increase the uniformity within fields. And so it lessens that impact. And now we're only subjected to those really, really monstrous droughts that we have. So we begin to understand these different dynamics that are going on. So now we begin to see that here's the first of the what ifs. Which one of those principles of soil health should I implement to see the best result? Or is there one regenerative practice more effective than another? Anybody have any idea?
Assess where you're at and figure out which one would best address your needs.
Okay. Gets back to the critical analysis of what's in each field and everything else, but in reality, and that is a question I get from a lot of producers saying, what should I really do first? Which of these practices are out there? Unfortunate part, you go back to this diagram here. Which one of those pieces can you take out of that circle? None of them, right? That's the thing we begin to understand, that we are dealing with a system. We're dealing with a system, we're not dealing with a menu. I'll give you a little anecdotal story. I spent a lot of time with EPA. You can all boo and hiss, but I spent a lot of time with EPA, and I actually had a meeting in Washington at one time. And a lady came up to me and she said, well, I'm in charge of helping EPA understand how producers adopt practices, all the other things that are going on. And she said, well, my understanding is that we've got tillage practices, we have fertility practices, we've got weed control practices, we got all these other things. And how do farmers choose which one of those things they do? And I said, no, you don't understand agriculture at all. She thought agriculture was a menu-driven process. Pull down from column A, pull down from column B, pull down from column C, pull down from column D, and you figure out what you're going to do each year. I go, no, you need to come to Iowa. And so I toured her for a week, about 8 different producers throughout Iowa that could explain to her farming systems. It changed their whole attitude about how agricultural practices are implemented. Not implemented as a menu, but implemented as a system. Things are linked together. And you realize that in regenerative agriculture, all of these things are related. Maximizing diversity, cover, tillage, all of those things are a part of a system. And we need to start thinking about soil health as a system-driven approach that we begin to look at and say what's going on from that perspective. And so we've talked about how soil health practices affect the crop, but how does soil health practices affect the soil out there? And so those really begin the part of this puzzle. I love this diagram that Don Rakowski put together because Don spent a lot of time looking at CO2 evolution coming out of soils after they were tilled. And Don is fantastic for drawing diagrams and everything else. On the left, it's before primary tillage. After the primary tillage, you break it into big chunks. You have major CO2 loss coming out of that. After secondary tillage, you take those bigger chunks and make them into smaller chunks, and there's still a puff of CO2 coming out of that. And we see that in every time that we do tillage out there and we've got equipment that can measure CO2, is that we see these bursts of CO2 coming out. We also see a burst of water coming out as well. So both of those things are occurring simultaneously. All of these other pieces, Don had this little system that he could go in different tillage systems and he plopped down and measure the CO2 loss coming out of it. It was tractor mounted and you just plop it down on the field and all of this. And so when you look at cross-sectional area, is that the bigger the area that we were loosening out of there, the higher the carbon loss. And so when we talk about minimizing tillage, it's a matter of how small can we get it, still get that fertilizer in, get that seed bed in there, and limit the amount and let everything else be undisturbed and covered in part of that soil process. So those become part of these different dynamics that we need to look at in terms of these what ifs. So what if I till? Well, expect a certain amount of soil loss coming out. accept the disruption of what's going on in these different dynamics. If you've been here before, you've seen this slide. It's a meta-analysis by Wishmeyer and his co-workers talking about what are the factors that really cause soil organic carbon change in soils. And across all the worldwide literature. So if we want to change soil organic carbon, we want to change dynamic carbon within the soil, is that we have to understand that it's driven by the microorganisms, it's driven by the fauna within the soil. And the next thing that's really influences all this is the texture of that soil. Clays really become part of that overall process. And then we get into land use and management as we begin to change that, what type of vegetation that's out there, the climate that we're working on, the topography, north slopes, south slopes, all of this, parent material, and then finally physics and chemistry. This diagram really kind of set a different tone of how people looked at soils, realizing the importance of the biological system and being able to change out there. Is that if we want soils to change, it's really about the biology. And if we want soils to change, we have to figure out how do we get that energy down into the system. We've had an abundance of sunlight. We're taking that, making a simple sugar out of it. We're putting that sugar back through the whole plant, exuding it out the roots, feeding those microbial systems and all of this, because we're just putting them on a sugar high. We're just adding that sugar in that, we're supplying energy. And if we want to change that system, we have to supply more energy than what it takes for maintenance. It's always a bad time of year to give this talk because we're through the holiday season, we're through Thanksgiving, we got Christmas and New Year's. Biggest weight gain time of all the year. That's because we have more calories going in than we consume, than we maintain. Same thing happens in our biology. If we want that biology to change, we've got to get more energy than it takes for maintenance. And so we've got to continue to do this. And you think about those practices saying, I'm going to maximize living roots, I'm going to maximize cover out there. It's all about supplying energy into that system or not preventing it from leaving. That's really all the pieces of this puzzle in terms of these different dynamics that are going on. And so these soil health indicators, microbial biomass is how rapidly is that microbial biomass changing out there, even the populations that are going on. Running different tests and saying what are the biology and what are those biological components. You've got CO2 burst that is coming out. We see all that because we see that in terms of living systems. What do? We take in oxygen, we give off CO2. Microbial systems do the same thing. We see all this. Aggregate stability and size. How rapidly and how stable are those aggregates near the surface out there? How rapid is the infiltration rate going on? And all of those begin to manifest themselves back in plant observations. We see it in terms of vigor, we see it in color, we see it in uniformity among plants. All of those different things that are occurring are indicators of all of this. And so when you think that some of the soil health tests out there, they're really about this. But you can do infiltration yourself. You can do the simple little ring test, or I like the poor man's method, and that is go out in your field and look after a 2-inch rain and look at what the surface looks like. Because if you have little rivulets running off and you see water moving in there, it says your infiltration rate isn't good enough. If you don't see anything, you're getting it all down in there. Or you can go out and during the deluge and see how much water is running off the edge of your field. Simple things like this in terms of these different dynamics. So here's a what if. What if I supply more energy into the system than is required? And just remember I said you wouldn't do all this. So I'm going to take you through a little study that I'll give you a little background on it. and everything else, and it's on native systems, it's not on corn and beans, so if you're not into native systems, it'll still be educational for you, is that there's been observations made on range in eastern Colorado where as they began to increase the CO2 levels, the protein content in grass went down. Because what we're doing is we're decoupling the carbon-nitrogen cycle within that. And we found that in controlled studies, and we've done a lot of these, is that if we increase the energy transfer, we increase microbial activity, we increase soil aggregates, soil carbon, respiration, all those other things. So we see all these different pieces. How do we get energy into that system? Is that we can stimulate the grass and forbs to add more exudates in by enhancing the soil biological system. I have the fortunate piece is my sister and brother-in-law farm the farm where I grew up on, so I have 500 acres to play with. At least he tolerates and let me play on them. But anyway, in 2003 we did a little study in combination with QLF where we added their 2 gallons of boost and then some UAN, amino 15, and in late 23. And we harvested the grass by clipping and analyzing forage quality. We put that piece in there saying we didn't want to invest more than $20 an acre into that system. So we kind of constrained the dynamics of all of this. What we found is that we increased productivity by 400 to 900 pounds of grass per acre with a 2-point crude protein increase. That's phenomenal in grass. Right, Brian? If we can increase crude protein, we can change the stocking rates. The potential profit increase that was going on was about $80 an acre. We invested 20, we got 100 back, we had $80 in profit. So that gave us confidence to saying, we did a crazy study in 23, what happens if we go to 24 and all of this? And an observation from 24, because this is on a system, was that the cattle went to that spot in that pasture to graze first before any other part of that field. They had grazed it down because that was a different system. So we expanded it from 1 site to 7 sites and all of this. You have to realize that all of this is volunteer piece. So we went to northern Oklahoma, all these different places, Kansas. We did 7 treatments, replicated twice and all this. I'll just take you through all this. These are the different soils that are out there. I see a lot of you taking pictures. If you want these slides, I'll be glad to give them to you. You can have them at the end. Or send me an email. My contact information will be at the end, and I'd be glad to send them to you. So we did all these different soils out there. Brian Knapp from QLF did all the application. He has a special little applicator at the back of the pickup where we could put these trials on. We we grass clipped, we weighed in quality, we did forage quality on all the samples. We began to run the soil test with the Haney test that are being collected. So what we really did is begin to understand that adding that value and adding that energy into that, because these are carbon-based products with biologicals with them. To look at crude protein, we look at the relative feed value, total digestible nutrients. Full disclosure, they're not consistent across all locations, because that really has made us ask some questions about what may be happening in all of this in terms of native systems that are in there in that soil biology. I'm not promoting a product, but really, how do we begin to change this system in terms of forage quality? Because 80% of our rangeland is in a less than fair condition. And so if we want to continue to do this, we can have a system. Just, it may not show up as well, but when we took pictures as we began to do these treatments, you could see the color differences across all of that. Here's this example. I just used 2 sites, just a comparison from northeast Kansas to western Kansas. Crude protein didn't always go up. It went down a little bit at times, but relative feed value did go up. Production went up. Western Kansas, we took the crude protein clear up to 3.5 points above baseline. Relative feed value up 23 pounds of protein, 356 pounds of more protein per acre. And we had almost a 1,600 pound increase in production out there. So we can really begin to change this system in lots of different ways. If you just look at all these different things, is that changing dry weight, the more dry weight we actually had a positive increase with crude protein and relative feed value and total digestible nutrients. We see all these other pieces that are going on. We can change this system in lots of different ways by putting more energy into it. This positive impact in terms of forage quality is a capture of energy by that plant, but no dilution impact. A lot of times when we grow a bigger plant, we actually reduce the value because of just dilution and all of this, but we didn't see that. We have to understand in terms of quality, and this has been one of our big pieces going on, is looking at this linkage between soil health, forage, grain, or produce quality in terms of direct impact of enhancing soil health. So we need to start focusing on this quality aspect. Dave Brandt, when he talked here, talked about how much protein had gone up in his corn. We see that as we're going on as well. We're seeing other pieces of this puzzle because that becomes the value of soil health. That becomes a different metric of how do we look at this system. Here's another what if. What if the changes are not what we expect? I think a lot of people go way out of here saying, gee, you know, if I do all this, this is always going to happen. This is that same farm that we work on. This is our oat crop this spring and everything. I was down there in May working with my brother-in-law and all this, and he goes, we need to look at this field because all the tests are showing that we should have a tremendous crop. We've got a CO2 score of 326. We've got carbon, nitrogen 11-1. The soil health score of almost 30. PLFA was excellent. Diversity was very good in all of this. And yet this oat crop looked just terrible. It wasn't even tillering at times. And for oats not to tiller, that's really sad. And so you see all these other pieces that are going on. So I went back and I began to pull out images and everything else. And I isolated that field in the lower left-hand corner out there. This is what it looked like. And all these other pieces. It didn't show up very well. There's oats along that, other oats in the same farm out there. Tremendous oats. About 4 tons per acre. That oat crop that we just harvested, there was about 1. And all the things has been driving us nuts. But then we took that oat crop off, put it back into Sudan and everything else. And the Sudan crop has just been gangbusters in terms of growth. It's about 5 tons per acre out there and everything else. And the protein out of that has been enormous. And so now we've got to understand maybe what's happening in a rotation system that's all of these different pieces that are going on. And so it's just been driving us crazy. Actually, I did trying to drive Rick crazy with what's wrong with the Haney test and all of this. But, you know, it's not as simple as that. And what if we change the system to start focusing on dynamics? A lot of you have seen this before because we have this real understanding of really what's happening in terms of temperature at the surface out there. These are hours above 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and all of this that's when we begin to denature protein in all of this. And you see that we've got some years when we manage or maintain soil armor, we begin to reduce the temperature extremes that are in the soil. We can maintain those temperatures in the optimum range for microbial activity. And so we see that changing in all of this, but the other dynamic is that when we maintain that soil armor, is that we protect against raindrop energy, so that energy that a raindrop hits the surface with is absorbed by that residue and then slowly moves in, so we maintain an infiltration rate. The other piece is that we reduce soil water evaporation coming back out. We also reduce the soil temperature in all of these different pieces. And the third part is that we just change the whole root distribution of that crop because we've got residue out there. So we get three advantages for soil water that have a tremendous impact. This next scenario you have to blame on Roy Foxcroft, because Roy and I were standing in the middle of a field in February, eastern Colorado. I think the wind was calm that day. It was only about 30 miles an hour. That's low wind speed when I've been out there having to work in the field. But I did a cropping scenario because Roy said, what if I changed row spacing and what would that do for us? So I did a simulation of a millet crop saying if I went from a 30-inch row to a 10-inch row, what would happen? So I simulated the potential growth patterns, the ability to capture energy, transfer that energy into the soil. Bottom line is I began to reduce the stress in that 10-inch row plant because the soil was cooler to surface. Because I was shading that quicker, I had the residue on the surface. I had less heat stress coming out because there's heat stress comes from that soil surface that nobody ever talks about, because if we get a surface temperature of 120 degrees, zero humidity with a dry surface at that, is that we're creating a lot of atmospheric demand, not by what we move across the crop, but what we move up in the soil. And we put that plant under a lot of stress just because of having a bare soil surface in between. If we've got a residue layer, that temperature that's going by in all of this is typically in the mid-80s. And so we see all these different pieces. So we see a cooler that. The plants were more efficient in capturing sunlight and converting it to sugar. So we can expect more sugar going into that soil. Those graphs all look the same because we use the same soil radiation value. We're capturing that. But I want you to pay attention to the scale difference. The 30-inch rows, we're only capturing about, at the maximum, about 10 megajoules. And I know that unit doesn't mean anything to you. But as opposed to that 10-inch rows, we were at 20. We captured twice as much energy out of that crop. We could put twice as much energy into that root system that begin to change that soil out there. And we begin to see these effects when we begin to change the dynamics of our cropping system. We see tremendous things that occur and have potential impact on our soil biology, because the attributes that we talk about, changing water, changing temperature, all of those have an impact on that subsequent crop out there. And we see all these other little pieces that are going on. So what becomes important to all of us is realizing that in a dynamic system, things do not occur all at the same time. We can influence water immediately with how we change regenerative practices. We keep that residue out there, we keep that standing crop out there, we're absorbing all this, we see that different dynamic. And I can change that within the first day I do something. But carbon takes weeks. We see carbon begin to change within weeks after that. We change the nutrient cycling in terms of months. So you have to realize, everybody says, well, all these things are occurring. Yes, but they're occurring at different time scales. You need to understand that things do not occur simultaneously in nature. Things are built upon things that are built upon that are built upon. And see all these different dynamics that are going on. But in reality, what you saw in that millet example was just really what you see here, is that we increase the soil water, we decrease plant stress. If we decrease plant stress, we increase plant growth. If we increase plant growth, we increase the carbon that goes into that soil. If we increase carbon going into the soil, we increase the microbial activity and nutrient cycling because we've got more exudates and more energy going into that system. As we begin to change aggregates, we can begin to increase soil water storage and all of these different dynamics. But the feedback loop is that as we begin to do this, we increase plant growth. These become a cycle that we need to begin to understand in all of this. But I'm going to switch gears and talk about some other what-ifs. What if we begin to consider soil health as part of an ecological system? And it's not just about what happens within this field, but what happens beyond the field boundaries. Not moving sediment off the field, changing water quality dynamics, changing the overall pieces of that puzzle. And what if we begin to look at increased infiltration, yield stability over time and space, or changing the whole hydrologic cycle? Because now we're going to shift all of these different pieces. But what if we took the long-term view and continually tweaked the system? Adaptive management in terms of saying we're going to do these things, but we're going to continually adjust them each year in terms of taking advantage of what I've learned. And that gets back to that critical analysis of what's in each field. Or what if we begin the process of sharing experiences and comparing results? I'm a firm believer that in conferences like this, that it's really about what's working, what isn't working, and what do we have questions about. I've been retired 5 years. My wife wonders if I've ever retired. But in those 5 years, I've come to the conclusion that every day is a learning experience, and that most of what I knew before, I've had to reshape in the last 5 years, because things aren't always like they seem. And if we're going to move forward, we're going to have to figure out how to share those experiences more effectively. What if we build community? I have a little group in Kansas, not a little group, but a group called the Prairie Soil Pioneers that we formed back in 2020. Prairie Soil Pioneers focuses on cover crops both in rotational grazing as well as in cash grain crops. They are a community that's begun to figure out how to share information back and forth. And I think that's going to become, in all of this, is how do we form those communities of learning experiences and everything. And then, what if we really have honest talk about our successes and failures in all of this? I'm going to leave you with my contact information, because here's my email address and here's my cell phone number and everything else.